Now, before we begin the substance, let me introduce to you our three panelists, and then audience, going to ask you a question as well to see what you think about this topic and get us understanding a little bit more about your thoughts on this topic before we get into it. But let me quickly introduce our panelists before that. First, I have Professor Kidane, who is a Fulbright scholar and a tenured associate professor of law at the Seattle University School of Law. We're very pleased to have him with us today. He teaches and writes in the area of international arbitration and litigation, immigration law, international law, and he's published a comprehensive book on dispute settlement in China-Africa economic relations, especially focusing on investment and commercial arbitration. So he's a perfect panelist for this question, and he has a new book on diverse cultures in the new world of international arbitration, pulling on those experiences. He has taught in various different law schools, and also practiced in Washington at Piper Rudnick, which is now DLA Piper, and a number of different practices. So he continues to consult in these areas with law firms. We're really happy to have him today. Thank you so much, Professor Kidane, for being willing to spend your time with us and share your insights with us. Next, I have Siddharth Chatterjee, who is the UN Resident Coordinator for China. He took office as the resident coordinator on 16th of January 2021, so is fairly new to the post, but has really got into the post with gusto. Any of you who follow him on Twitter or WeChat will know that he's posting every single day regularly on the different people who he's meeting and different activities that he's engaged in China. He has more than 25 years of experience in international cooperation, sustainable development, and he's coming from Kenya as the resident coordinator in Kenya to China, and also held other leadership positions across the organization, including as resident representative of UNDP and UNFPA in Kenya as well. He was also regional director for the United Nations Office for Project Services in Denmark, and a range of different countries who worked in Somalia, South Sudan, and also worked in the Red Cross movement as well. So we're again very, very pleased to have Mr. Chatterjee with us. I'm going to call him Sid. He told me I could. So thank you so much for joining us as well, and taking the time out of your busy schedule to discuss this with us. I know you've got a lot of views about where the future directions, so I'm really looking forward to hearing that. And last but not least, we have Professor Tang Xiaoyang, who is resident scholar and the Deputy Director of the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and also Associate Professor in the Department for International Relations at Tsinghua as well. He recently published a book which he very kindly invited me to review and discuss in a seminar, and so I'm again very, very pleased. His book focuses on China-Africa cooperation as well, and especially through industrialization and manufacturing and special economic zones and so on. So again, really fantastic to have you with us today, Professor Tang. Thank you so much. Okay, so now you all know who you're going to be hearing from. Let's see what you all think about this topic. And in our social media about this topic, we talked about the webinar is entitled "Can Africa Manage China?" And I guess the question is, do you think it should? So let's see what's our poll for the audience before we get into this. So audience, please let us know, what degree do you think African countries currently have a proactive China strategy? So you've got three options there. You've got African countries all have a proactive China strategy. Option two, I know of a few that have a proactive China strategy. And then the last option, I don't think African countries have a proactive strategy. So what do you think about this question? Do you think African countries have a proactive China strategy? We'll give you a few more seconds to answer. Getting quite close. And then we'll have a look at the results. The panelists can't share, but we'll ask them what they think. We'll find out. Okay, just 2 more seconds. 2 or 3 more seconds, please, audience, please do vote. Okay, and I think there we have it. Should we close the poll? Let's see what the result is. All right, so we have, right, very clear. 67% of the audience think that there are a few African countries that have a proactive China strategy. 27% think that African countries don't have a proactive strategy, and just 7% of the audience think African countries all do have a proactive China strategy. So let's see who's right. And in any case, perhaps we can start, perhaps even go back to kind of thinking what is the point, in a sense, of having a China strategy. We'll be asking that question today as well. So Professor Kidane, perhaps you could kick off for us. Do you think African countries have a strategy towards China, or to what degree do they have a strategy towards China?
Thanks so much, Hannah. If I didn't think they had any strategies coming into this webinar, now I do think they do, because the poll suggests that at least 67% of the respondents believe that, or maybe know, some of them, that some African countries do have a China strategy, and I'm not surprised by that. Some definitely do. And if you could just look at election campaigns across Africa, especially in the bigger countries, there's always a China element. Chinese strategy, Chinese involvement in African economies is usually a point of contention. But having a well-articulated and sustained strategy for a particular country is mostly an attribute of the world's largest and more advanced capital sending economies. It's usually top-down, not bottom-up. So the conditions and negotiating powers of the smaller capital receiving economies of Africa, their conditions do not permit them to have meaningful and sustained strategies that they could advance at every interaction that they have with China. And their main preoccupation is to balance the competing powers. And their strategy tends to focus on that situation. So the strategy is mostly on how to play that power balance between Western interests, Chinese interests. That said, since the establishment of FOCAC in 2000, at the more global level, I mean, within Africa, Africa has had a collective and significantly unified strategy towards China through the African Union. And evidence of this is the FOCAC declarations, action plans, and some very significant issues are always on the agenda, such as state sustainability and things like that. Individually, they tend to be responsive to Chinese strategic plans. An excellent example of this is BRI. So when BRI is implemented in Africa, the African reaction is responsive to BRI. And these undertakings are structured in very ad hoc basis in a series of contractual instruments. So that is what I'd like to say at the very beginning. I don't want to take more time, but I'm sure we'll come back to this discussion. That's what I'd like to offer at this point.
Great. Well, that's a great introduction to this question, and I think that's really interesting that you're saying that it's not necessarily a full strategy in a sense, but it's a balancing with others. Sid, can I come to you now? would you agree with this? And would you say as well, you know, we're now in the post-COVID, we're in a COVID-19 era, still in COVID-19 era. Do you think that that is, if that is the correct diagnosis, is that enough? Is there a need to reimagine Africa's relationship to China and Africa's strategy with regards to China? What would you say?
Sure. Well, I think what Kidane said was absolutely pertinent. But what COVID has reminded us that it has put the spotlight on the levels of inequality that exist, not just in the world, within countries, across countries. And I think whether it's the global north or the global south, it has exposed those vulnerabilities. But in Africa in particular, it has exposed also the nature of the heterogeneous nature of the African continent. And at the same time, how Africa responded to COVID has actually showed a particular strength, which actually defies many of those who said that probably Africa would just crumble under the COVID pandemic. And yet, you know, it kind of not just managed to confront it, but actually came through pretty well. I feel that given the reality that the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis that has hit the entire world, where lives and livelihoods have been shocked, and it echoes the Great Depression of the 1930s, perhaps this is the moment as we get to FOCAC by the end of December for Africa to really come together and revisit the purpose of the African Union and ensure that it has a much more robust negotiating posture. Because I think if the world is to realize the future is Africa, Africa's prosperity will lead to the world's prosperity, given the reality that we are going to see an emerging demographic echo of aging from Asia into the United States, into Europe. And here is a continent which is vibrant at the median age of 18. The possibilities are limitless. What we need to give reality and velocity to is how do these regional bodies better integrate and have a sustained common policy. And I think this is where China and Africa could build a bridge which could harness the entire ecosystem of good political will, of good public policies and good partnerships to really give velocity to the Sustainable Development 2030 agenda for Africa, and keeping in mind the big picture of the Africa Vision 2063. Over to you.
Absolutely, Sid, and fully agree. This is, you know, this is an opportunity, right? Certainly an opportunity for African countries to be, in a sense, perhaps even more demanding of their partners, given that demographic, given that shift. We just did a video interview with Andrew Ali, who's the head of Southbridge Group and the former president of the African Finance Corporation, and he was talking about, you know, 15 million young people entering the employment, needing to get jobs every single year. You know, it's very, very crucial, but also a great opportunity for that to happen. Who's going to take advantage? Professor Tang, Professor Kidane just talked about FOCAC, which was established in 2000. We're 21 years now since it was established. Is that enough? Does China actually want African countries to be more strategic with FOCAC or in other ways and through their bilateral relations as well? What would be the benefits, but also the challenges of that potentially?
Yeah. In fact, I think the partner with a strong strategy will be also in the interest of China, because China always thinks that the cooperation with other countries should be win-win, namely through this trade, investment, also financing, lending. Then both partners should get benefits from this cooperation. And in that context, then partner with a strong vision, which can actually secure some long-term benefits for that country. That will also be good for the cooperating partners. So maybe some examples is when China now gives this loans to the through FOCAC. So China always actually a lot of Chinese institutes, they find it quite difficult for them to have a good projects to lend for new infrastructure projects. Because these projects, they should be designed by the African partners. Only the African partners, they know which projects fit their interests and fit their local conditions. But the Chinese, they like to ask the African partners and inquire their opinions on that. But in order for the African partners, in order to come up with ideas, with good project proposals, then they first need to have a good strategy. They should know where this projects, infrastructure projects or industry investment should lead these countries to. They should not be just scattered because that cost a huge amount of loans. And if they do not contribute to Africa's long-term prosperity, then China also is in danger of recovering these loans, like we are experiencing for the last 3 or 4 years. We saw such risks. So therefore, if African countries can come up with a clear strategy and can correspondingly provide good proposals for the infrastructure and also industrialization and other development projects, China will be very happy to see that.
That's good news, I guess. And I think, and as you say, certainly there is definitely an issue with the kinds of projects and the financing that much more is needed for sure, and much more, there's certainly much more demand. How to drive up the quality of that is a real challenge. And being more strategic with China and being clear about what those needs might be could be a good way through. Professor Kidane, though, I mean, you have been in many of these arbitration discussions, and you see the balance of power between Chinese partners and African partners. We've just, there have been reports just in the last week pulling together a number of different contracts of China and other developing countries, not just African countries, I have to say, and they all have special clauses and so on. Would being strategic, having a strategy, would it help with these sorts of issues, or is there something more that's needed, would you say?
Yes, as Sid suggested earlier, having this collective front increases the negotiating powers of the African states. In any kind of relationship, economic relationship, the negotiating power obviously has significant implications in the contractual terms. And am I connected or?
You are, yep, we can hear you perfectly.
So if you look at some of the instruments, the contractual instruments, and we can divide them into 2 sections. So one is the pure loan instrument. The other one is just works contract. It could be construction works or any number of other types of contracts. There is invariably a difference of balancing, power balance between the two. So if take an example, the dispute resolution clause, it usually says it is either in China before CTAC tribunals or something along those lines, or Chinese law applies. So those obviously are a function of the negotiating power. And this is not unique to China. It's the same. Every lender would have that negotiating power to make the recipients enter into those kinds of contracts. We haven't seen very serious contractual disputes between Chinese companies or Chinese lenders and African states. They are emerging. There are two claims, investor state claims. We will see how that plays out. But generally, to make them well balanced, I think the negotiating powers have to be also balanced, and you cannot do it in any meaningful way if they are negotiating individually. So these instruments have to be public, and the African Union needs to have access to them, and they need to be scrutinized. And as Professor Tang suggested, a country that is able to have its own strategy is a better partner for China. That is what I'd like to add.
Thanks. So we already have a Q&A question that's come in from our audience. Please, audience, please keep those coming in. We will definitely come to them really soon. And they're already touching on some of the questions, some of the points that we're discussing. So that's wonderful. Sid, we're starting to talk a little bit about financing, and the rest of the other webinars that we've held have been about financing, not specifically with regards to China, but on other issues. But coming back to China, finance is not the only issue, of course. If you're thinking about a strategy with China, from your experience, what are the other areas that African countries can and should be working with China on in order to take advantage of this opportunity and to do better, to negotiate better and get more out of their relationship with China? What are the other areas beyond finance, if any?
I see Africa as the ground for the new Marshall Plan. If you look at the old Marshall Plan post Second World War, what it did was three things in Western Europe, which had been ravaged by two world wars, and in between that was the Great Depression too, which is an economic crisis that we are now witnessing, but perhaps the world witnessed then. But it lifted Europe, first of all, out of poverty. It opened up new markets for the United States. And it really rearranged the ecosystem of Europe, and therefore it led to the foundation of the European Union. There was a Belt and Road of sorts which happened in Europe too, and that's how Europe got connected. Now, I see precisely that opportunity in Africa, and therefore I see enormous opportunities for the world to actually unite. I actually see better convergence of the US, of China, of the European Union coming together and looking at Africa from a real scalable public-private partnership point of view. The China-Africa relationship is not recent, Hannah, as we know. I mean, it goes back way back as the 7th century, when the first direct exchanges and contacts took place along the east coast of Somalia and Kenya. And then 15th century, we actually saw more robust relationships. And then after, China really, when it became a true republic, so to speak, in 1949, perhaps some of the greatest outreaches were done from China to Africa. So the relationship is time-tested in many ways. What I see is the opportunity is that in the next 10 years, here are some statistics. Agribusiness in Africa is going to be $1 trillion worth in the 2030 agenda. We are going to see $1 trillion worth. Can Africa and China come together and use some of the technology and innovation and data that China has been able to use to leapfrog its own economy? I mean, what China has managed to do in the last 40 years, and particularly in the last 7 years of lifting close to 90 million people out of poverty, is simply remarkable. There are many lessons that Africa could learn from this, and China, Africa, and the rest of the world could converge around this one specific area. You were talking about 15 million young people looking for work every year. That is an absolute reality. I actually co-authored a piece with the former president of Ghana, John Mahama. And, this is a demographic dividend which must be reaped. Otherwise, we are going to look at many more Africans getting onto boats and heading to Europe simply because 50% of food production in Africa is lost to post-harvest. And then, Africa is a net importer of $70 billion worth of food. Can we change that narrative? I believe China can help change that narrative. Take the issue of public health. I believe, COVID has reminded us that universal health coverage becomes mission critical. We heard that into 2 sessions from the vice premier comparing health and wealth. And this is not new. It was said by Herophilus way back in 265 BC about the primacy of healthcare. And that is what allows civilizations and humans to survive and thrive. It's going to be a $400 billion enterprise in Africa over the next 10 years. Take the space of affordable housing, which is going to be about $700 billion. If we look at the manufacturing sector, the green economy, the blue economy, I mean, these are trillions and trillions of dollars enterprises in the next 10 years. How do we take advantage of that? And this is where we need to see the convergence of big data technology and innovation and the true rearrangement of multilateralism, which really springboards Africa towards that next generation of prosperity, where everybody will prosper in this. So therefore, a rich Africa will mean a rich world. An impoverished Africa, there will not be any longer a rich world because those markets will no longer be available. So it is best to invest in it now. So I have seen what China has done in Africa, and I would commend China for some of the remarkable things that Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as I've seen in Ethiopia or in Kenya or in Uganda, in Sudan, in Zambia, in South Africa, is simply remarkable. And I think what we now need is the enterprise of convergence, the enterprise of trust, the enterprise of public-private partnerships to really take this to scale. Africa's population will be 2.4 billion by 2050, of which 900 million will be young people. It is perhaps the largest market waiting of consumers and producers. I mean, in the next 10 years, the consumption, just consumption in Africa would be close to $2 to $3 trillion. Now, where we can be, where I see the new form of multilateralism, where the United Nations can play a role, is how we can work with the United Nations country teams in Africa, from here in China, working with the government, working with the private sector, and bringing it all together. We've seen this work in Kenya, and I want to quote you a very clear example to this. When Huawei, Merck, Philips, GlaxoSmithKline, Safaricom came together, we were able to reduce maternal mortality ratios in some of the highest burden counties by 1/3. It just showed the spirit of public-private enterprise and its transformational effect. And that's the future I see in Africa. Over to you. Sorry, I took a little long.
No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, this is very important, and you've gone also into the question of what role for international organizations there might be in supporting that, kind of coming up with ideas, making sure these things go forward, sharing experience across different countries. And I guess it's needed. Professor Tang, you've had experience of working with so many Chinese and observing this and interviewing so many Chinese companies, private sector in particular, who have gone to African countries trying to, do their best and find an enterprise working in the special economic zones. How much would it help from their point of view practically? I mean, you talked about the kind of demand side and the win-win. Is that good enough? What would be special about an African strategy for China specifically versus an African strategy for other countries or for other investors, for instance? What's special about Chinese investment, if anything?
I think China has a special advantage in Africa because China has itself just experienced very fundamental transformation in its own economic structure as well as social structure. So during last 40 years, China then grew from mainly agrarian traditional economy and quite a backward economy then to industrial powerhouse. And this experience actually helped a lot of Chinese enterprises to see the potential of Africa. Because when they arrived in Africa, they see that Africa looks just like China 40 years ago. And then, therefore, they are more confident in Africa's future. There are a lot of Europeans or Americans who maybe just see risks and see the stagnation in Africa. So for China, apart from this confidence in Africa's future, China also has the economic structure which is complementary to Africa's. Because China's manufacturing, some of them are still based on the labor-intensive ones, although they are reducing, and some are quite low value added, not so capital intensive. Whereas those industries, industry sectors in the West, then they are very capital intensive. And so with this labor intensive and low value added sectors, China can find easily the entry to African market. Because currently the African consumers, they are the local market as well as a production basis. Africa can just start from this rather the basic manufacturing and industrial sectors. So China can, China's industry is a good match for this African's industrialization stage, while the Western companies, maybe they just are too advanced, and the complementarity is low. So with this being said, then I think the strategy for Africa, for targeting at the Chinese investors, is trying to start from this the pragmatic from this to take advantage of this complementarity, and to just start from not to look at some fancy things or but more like to have the to target at this initiating industries, and then to focus on this complementarity of the economic structure on both sides. On the other hand, then learning the experience of this social economic transformation in China, and then try to understand how this kind of transformation can also then work in Africa. This is also the other side of the Africa's strategy targeting at China. Yeah.
Right, that's very helpful. So we have a few elements of a strategy that it seems that you're all suggesting. Obviously, financial, industrialization and jobs, also potentially public-private partnerships around health, for instance, but also agriculture. Professor Kidane, do you have any other suggestions in terms of areas for a strategy or strategies?
Yes, so Professor Tang mentioned Chinese pragmatism, economic pragmatism, and something that the African economies could actually borrow from, and also a careful scrutiny of the development model that China is following.
Yeah.
And there is And if we are proceeding to the recommendations stage, then I could outline a few of those. I don't know, Hannah, if that is where we're headed right now.
We can head there. We do have a couple of questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to encourage audience again to please share your questions. Before we move, we will go to a point at which we're asking what recommendations our panelists will have for African leaders, African governments. But maybe I'll ask you one other question then before we move to that, which is, if African countries don't have, or if there's not this collective, let's say an Africa-China strategy, or a specific Africa-China strategies for particular countries, what would you say are the risks if that doesn't happen? Are there any risks, or is it okay to just kind of keep going? There's FOCAC. FOCAC's going to be every 3 years. What's the point, in a sense?
Hannah, I believe that the question of strategy for each one of these African countries is actually a function of their domestic political dynamics.
Right.
And at the very beginning of my remarks, that was what I tried to get at. Because if you look at each one of these African countries, Chinese involvement in their economy and a dominant role is a subject of great political controversy. So whatever strategy emerges as one party prevailed in an election could be completely different when that party is no longer in leadership position. Example could be, Zambia, Ghana, and places like Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So you talk about, so these things are very dynamic, and it is also situation dependent. When I say that, a very simple example is if a railway project fails to yield the kind of return that the parties anticipated, it could become a huge political, contention.
It is in Kenya.
It is. So those are the kinds of things. So we cannot underestimate the dynamism of this. It's not like the United States where there is this fixed strategy towards such and such, countries, and this is a 10-year plan according to China. So you can't find those things in many of these African countries, although at any given moment, it's not impossible to find very specific China-related strategy, but those tend to evolve, and that's the dynamism that I'd like to emphasize.
Yeah, but let me interrogate that a bit more, because in some cases, it seems that there is a big difference between civil society and what government wants with regards to China. And then I guess the other point would be, and I think this is also something which Sid might come in on, is what's the role of the African Union as a collective? Is it to provide some more certainty in terms of strategy rather than going backwards and forwards depending on the domestic politics, or is it something else? Please, all of you on this one, but Professor Kidane first.
Yes, I think there's no doubt that within the African Union and individual African states, the preponderance is in favor of Chinese involvement in Africa. And the African Union efforts are robust, and China is very appreciative of that, I'm sure. And if you just read the FOCAC declarations for the last 20 years and the action plans, many of them have been executed with admirable efficiency. And Africa appreciates that, and China also knows that. And the question at this moment really is, could this be sustained? The reason why a question of sustainability is raised is because nothing really seems to have changed. The 2002 action plan, like the declaration, reads a lot like the one that was just issued, 20 years later. So there is a sense that it may have stagnated somewhere, or it might have, and there's some doubt that's now being expressed around Africa that Chinese enthusiasm in investing in Africa may not be as it used to be back in 2010, 2012, 2013. there's a host of different reasons, and we don't know where it's headed right now, but those are the kinds of things that people are looking at. But in any case, the African Union is a great partner to China. Everything is optimistic. And I think going forward, as long as China continues to grow, and Africa is also, just like Sid described, the growth potential is immense. So the collaborations between these two sides is almost inevitable, and it will probably continue to grow. How fast and under what circumstances is what we need to be discussing.
Right. How fast? Sid, what do you think of this question on domestic versus civil society? Is there anything you wanted to come in on that, or even the role of the African Union before we go to the audience Q&A?
I mean, the politics is a reality, but politics should not become an inhibitor to growth. And I think in many places, sometimes that starts to falter. And if you look at the Tanzania-Zambia railroad, it was transformational. I mean, seriously transformational. At a time when both countries needed a loan and actually went to the international financial institutions requesting for money, China itself was very poor then and decided to go ahead and finance it. And it really changed people's lives. It's regardless of which government is where. The fact of that matter is, it is how these countries utilize that railway system. And let me tell you, as much of criticism that I've seen directed as at the standard gauge railway in Kenya, I have traveled on that train. And let me tell you, railway projects don't generate profits like just overnight. They take time. Even the New York subway is in debt. These things, but they provide a commercial enterprise. They connect and make, commerce and trade happen. Yeah. I have seen the road, which is coming all the way from the port of Lamu, the Lapset Highway, which connects through the area of Moyale, where the country teams of Kenya and Ethiopia came together in 2015 to bring peace to 36 warring Somali ethnic clans. That road, Hannah, changed people's lives. I mean, suddenly the large number of young people that used to go and join Al-Shabaab found work along those places. They set up shops and businesses started to thrive. And just the fact that one road could transform people's lives, the velocity that we want in the growth of the Africa Free Trade Area will not happen unless that infrastructure connects all of Africa, which is not there. For trade and commerce, for the free movement of goods, services, and people to happen, it's not going to happen without that kind of investment. So I would be saying to the policymakers in China, guys, you have to step up your engagement in Africa. And for the African Union, guys, you need to be better integrated in a holistic manner so that you can actually present a wider market, a wider diversity that allows for the Africa Free Trade Area to succeed. To me, it's a win-win proposition. I don't see a dichotomy there at all. It is what is now important is that spirit of confidence, of trust, of collaboration, rather than that of global distrust. And you can paint things in different ways, Hannah, but the reality is those of us who worked in Africa for a long time have seen the true impact of these investments in the kind of transformation which is needed. I would just conclude by saying that Africa's growth trajectory is definite if it were to have what I would term as the 3 Ps of robust political will, of good public policy, of good partnerships. This is where, as I said, international organizations such as the United Nations system, which is what the Secretary General expects of a fit-for-purpose UN, working in a country team, in lockstep with the vision of the country, supporting the country in the implementation of these programs and projects. I think the relationship now needs to become China, Africa, and the UN, and the country teams working in those respective countries, providing those capacities, be it from public finance management to public health, to project management, to monitoring and evaluation, to making it happen at the grassroots. And this is where the Secretary General expects the UN to be highly ambidextrous in terms of the upstream public policy and influence of policy shaping, and at the downstream, providing the boots on the ground to make those things happen. I think this would be a fit for purpose relationship between China, the UN, and African countries. Over to you.
Thanks, Sid. And I think you pulled on that point about confidence, that it's really crucial. and to have that continued confidence. Now, look, we've got quite a few questions come in from the audience. I want to put all of them to you, and I hope we have some more as well. But they're in very different areas. So first of all, we have a question from Yang Wang from the Global Development Policy Center in Boston University. She actually featured in one of our webinars, brilliant interventions. She's asking about this publication about the 100 loan contracts, I think 24 of which were African. And the issue there is that the question was whether these have some special contracts and confidentiality. What do the panelists think of the contracts versus other bilateral lenders? And I think that would be particularly good for Professor Kidane to answer there. And then I think a question from Edwin. Let me just take 2 or 3 of these. Question from Edwin: what are some of the specific capacity building strategies that China can pursue in supporting Africa's human resource development? I think, Sid, that's quite a good one for you too. And then Professor Tang, we have a question from Mark Bender, who says, people have been saying China's interactions have been diminishing in the last 2 years, especially with regards to lending. We saw, again, some recent numbers come out from the size carry team of a reduction in 2019 of about 30% on loans. Do you see this happening, or do you think it's changing to a different form or phase? I think, again, you've all pointed to some of these points, but I think it's worth reiterating because the audience have asked. So let's go with those first 3 questions, and then we'll come back to some more after that. Professor Kidane, would you like to go on the first one on the contracts question? I'm guessing you've seen many of these, if not written about them already.
As my understanding is, many of the actual sovereign guaranteed loans are not public. We have some ideas about some of the contents, particularly the non-fiscal terms. And I can comment on those. In terms of the fiscal terms and the nature of these contracts, there are so many things that are being said out there, and one of them is something that I feel qualified to comment on, is the sovereign guarantee and also the waiver of sovereign immunity in case of default. That is what has been publicized, that China would be taking over ports and things of that sort. That was the kind of publicity that was out there. If you look at the instruments themselves, that does not support that kind of conclusion, and these are not extraordinary terms. The waiver of sovereign immunity is very common in these kinds of loan, as well as in contract, any other types of international or transnational contracts. What it is if a state defaults and is not able to pay, could it be sued in a foreign court or before an arbitral tribunal? There is some level of waiver of that kind of immunity enshrined in these instruments, but there hasn't been any aggressive attempt to utilize them so far. We haven't seen any. Even arise, the extent of enforceability of these awards or any kind of court judgment is doubtful. And is it theoretically possible that they could be pursued? Yes, but is it likely? And the answer would be.
Let me come to the specific question that she's asked, which is how different is that to other bilateral lenders? Because again, that would be a reason, in a sense, if China's very different in terms of those sorts of terms, to then be more strategic with regards to that and perhaps collaborate across countries on how to avoid those or negotiate better on those. Is that your experience?
It's very difficult to comment on that unless you actually have 2 instruments side by side and comparing each one. So my sense is the economic terms could be completely different. And I don't think any 2 instruments would have the same type of fiscal terms, right? These are negotiated commercial contracts in a way. So it required me to look at each instrument and be able to say, here's how they're different. And the other terms, I don't think there is anything extraordinary in Chinese loan contracts than World Bank loan contracts. And I've seen examples of each one of them. So there's really nothing extraordinary. and the publicity that China is exporting and engaging in this kind of date trap, and all that is just bad publicity that the officials need to respond to. I don't think it has in terms of contracts or otherwise.
Thanks. So that's not necessarily.
Hannah, maybe just on that,
Yes,
and just want to
please.
build a little bit on what Juan Kidane said, which is very wise, and his intellectual prowess really comes through over there. What I want to just comment on is that, firstly, regarding confidentiality clauses and, loan agreements between any country, and whether it's between China and African countries or wherever, the existence of confidentiality clauses in commercial contracts is a very normal, routine business practice, which conforms to any market economy. So, we should not make too much of a hullabaloo about the spirit of the contract and, and therefore the foundation of commercial interlinkages. So I think we should not make too much of a song and dance about these confidentiality clauses, because it's everywhere and it's global in nature. And second, I would just want to comment is the issue of repayment guarantees and escrow accounts in some cooperative projects. Again, that is not something out of the blue or something which is it is pretty much routine in financial transactions. And likewise, Chinese financial institutions are asking the borrowers. After all, people are borrowing because they need the money, and that is why there's debt. And Hannah, in your brilliant piece, you brought out that debt is not necessarily a bad thing, because these debts have allowed these many of these African countries to progress. Now, so the Chinese financial institutions do require the borrower to deposit a certain amount of funds in the escrow account, for example, and the fund is actually the revenue that the project itself generates. Now, using project revenue to repay loans are perhaps one of the most reasonable and sustainable arrangements that you can put in place, which is different from requiring a borrower, for example, to give priority to repaying Chinese loans that does not make Chinese financial institutions the so-called preferred, creditors. So this argument that China uses loans to influence foreign policy, again, maybe more of an imagination than absolute reality, given the fact that I've spent a fair amount of time and understanding the public policy space, which after all, as the UN, I will guide and advise the host country that I'm working with. And this is, I have not seen anything which is contrary to that. And it's so, this I just thought I would put into context rather than, leave it hanging as a mystery for the question that was asked. So I just want to back up Juan Kidane with a little more to that. Now let's come on to the human capacity thing. And I think that's a very, very important question. And this is where, again, I go back to saying Africa has a talent which is pretty remarkable. It is how we harness that talent in the space of public policy, in the space of economics, in the space of being able to galvanize that kind of dialogue and be able to undertake the project implementation. And when we are talking about project implementation, it is very much multi-sectoral. It needs different enterprises in different skill sets that need to come together. And that is why the Secretary General of the UN and the Deputy Secretary General of the UN is reminding their country teams in Africa, people, you have to be fit for purpose. You have to deliver as one, and you have to make sure that you leave no one behind. Now, to do that, we want to make sure that we are providing our African counterparts, our government counterparts, the best capacities. Let me give you an example of COVID itself. Mm-hmm. In Kenya, by the time we came to March, we knew that COVID would soon be arriving. By then, a plane load of supplies came in just when the complete breakdown of the global supply chains took place, of gloves, PPEs, etc. These aircrafts came from Ethiopia carrying Chinese supplies, which was actually very critical at that time when we were starting an early response. What did we do? We repurposed our UN Development Assistance Framework, took out about $45 million and put it into the public health response, deployed about 150 people from the UN country team to work with the government to build up the capacities in public health, to build up the capacities in communication, to build up the capacities in financial management, etc. And therefore, if you notice, the first few months, Kenya's response was pretty robust. And then we went and launched a flash appeal to further beef up the social protection measures. So what is important is how can we better utilize that trilateral cooperation of the UN working with African countries, making sure that they have the best in class human capacity available. So we build up that capacity at the micro level and the macro level so that the structures and the systems are so primed that they continue to function flawlessly as we advance to Vision 2063. So I see a critical role for the United Nations system to be working with Africa, to be working with China, and bringing it all together in terms of larger public-private partnerships to unlock that real potential that Africa has.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Great, thanks for sharing those examples with us. Professor Tang, I guess you may also have some thoughts on the capacity building side and human resource development, but please also do address this question about diminishing interest from China potentially. Is it diminishing, or is it just changing?
No, yeah, I think for this question on the interest on this diminishing loans and also on the capacity building, the key word as Sid and also Professor Kidane mentioned, is the key word is sustainability. So the human capacity building, actually, it's good to see this like a short-term reaction, and also the Chinese companies, when they invest, they also provide a lot of this short-term skill training, as well as some aid programs also give such trainings. But for Africa, I think a major challenge is how sustainable this can be. And often this company level training or this aid related trainings, after 1 or 2 years, as Sid just mentioned, if there's no like other sectors, there's no this industry system, then these skills, they cannot be applied into reality, into use. Then these trained workers, they may actually they may forget all these skills. And then how to train this and how to let these trainees keep their skills. This is not a question just of training, but it's all actually a comprehensive challenge of building the like a related commercial system, industrial system, so that these trainees, they can continuously improve and maintain their skills. I think the same is then also for the loans. So for this infrastructure loans during the past 5-10 years, a major problem is the sustainability issues. So China, I think for the currently, then they are even before the COVID, Chinese government was already thinking, rethinking about the effects of this financed projects in Africa, as well as in other like Belt and Road Initiative, because some of these projects do not have the revenues as expected. So that means so this actually increase for the recipient countries. That means the debt burden is increasing. For China, then that means the risk of default. So China is trying already before the COVID. China was already thinking of having a break, but that doesn't mean China is losing the interest or diminishing interest, because I see for China is just trying to wait for these countries to digest the finance these projects, and try to also China itself was trying to think about some better approaches to enhance the effectiveness and increase the sustainability of these financed projects. And I think this COVID-19 actually provides an opportunity for the whole world actually to stop and rethink, and still may be some chance of recovery in after the COVID. So that time with a better tactics and with better experience, I believe the new financing models maybe even benefit both sides with better results. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's pretty clear. Not diminishing interest, but perhaps trying to think through in a bit more detail. We have a few more questions coming in from the audience, and I think there's some very good ones talking about sustainability. Again, Professor Tang, you might want to say something about this, about environmental sustainability. What role will that play? What role should it play in China, Africa, and can African countries be more strategic about that too with China? Also for Professor Tang, and again, I would love all of you to come on these questions. Professor Tang specifically, do you think that the Chinese government is changing its communication strategy in Africa? So Jun Wenxue says, we have observed a significant change in the way that there is a communication with regards to Western countries from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So is there also going to be a similar change, less low-key, perhaps more direct, more proactive? So that's another question. And we've got two more others which are, I think, quite similar. So perhaps we could coming back to this question of finance and strategy with regards to finance. How can African countries reconcile any useful approaches on finance from China, the IMF, Paris Club when it comes to their financial trajectory? What should they be doing strategically to do that? And another question was on the financial question, and this is specific for Sid. How do you marry, this is from Samira Salifu, how do you marry this erroneous assumption that China uses its loans or debt trap diplomacy to influence policy with the information that China holds more than a third of African continent's sovereign debt? So that's with bilateral lending. That's not including private sector multilateral finance. So what would you say to that? Perhaps we should start with environmental sustainability in the order. Okay. Any thoughts on environmental sustainability, Professor Tang?
Sure, yeah. So in fact, the China's environmental practice in Africa and also in this Belt and Road Initiative is two-sided. On the one hand, China as the largest producer of renewable energy, like solar energy and also wind energy, China is also assisting some projects with this renewable energy. And that's already a part of quite a lot of African countries. They also see the opportunity of working with China on this renewable energy and also on like environmental preservation projects, because China's construction capacity is also very strong in that part. On the other hand, China is also blamed for some environmental destruction. For example, when China builds a hydro dam or builds coal-fired power plants, then often we saw some protests regarding the Chinese financed or constructed projects. I think they are not like contradictory, because both sides they are just both sides they are two sides of the development process, because that's also what China itself experienced. When you want to industrialize yourself, you must have some the centralized and power facility which are strong enough to provide the power need for industry and for urban use. And this is is inevitable for every country's development. But however, China is meanwhile always keeps this environmental sustainability also in mind. In fact, I grew up in Shanghai. I know that in Shanghai, as early as the 1980s, the city was already very proactive for the environmental protection. But however, with this industrialization process, other parts in China, then they still experienced some environmental deterioration during the next years. So there is two sides in my book and also in my previous articles. I said there are two responsibilities, namely developmental responsibility and environmental responsibility. The African countries as well as China, they need to think about both kinds of responsibilities. You need to achieve a balance and not just like go one side. Either to go to just only one side is too partial. And then regarding the,
I'm going to have to ask you to
okay.
because we've only got 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get to all the questions.
And regarding the communication strategy, yes, China is more outspoken in its attitude towards the US and the West. But I think for Africa, then at least it's a more friendship, this tone of friendship and win-win mutual benefits. So therefore, in that regard, it's different. Although China is actively using the media and also using diplomatic instruments to convey these ideas of friendship and of mutual benefits. It has already been this strategy has already been carried out for almost a decade, and it's increasing and improving. And but I think that's
intensifying. It seems like it's even more of an intensifying of that, perhaps in comparison to other countries.
Right. Okay.
Professor Kidane, your thoughts on some of the financing questions before we finish? We'll come to the last. Did you have any? Go ahead. Okay. And Sid, any thoughts on in terms of the use of diplomacy and versus China holding a lot of loans? I think we've gone through some of this. Look, I think we're about to. We also had another question that's come in, but we don't really have much time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you one last question, panelists, which I hope will kind of round up our discussion, and then we'll put the question to the audience about the issues that we've been discussing today. So if you were going to, this is my last question to you, panelists. If you're going to be advising African governments on what they should be doing on their interactions and strategy development with China, what would be your advice to them? And please just kind of quick fire, let us know what your advice would be in terms of a strategy. Professor Kidane.
I'll just say two things. One is structure every deal in clear and legally enforceable instruments. And the second one is push for institutionalization of FOCAC. FOCAC has been the way it is for 20 years, but I think it needs to take some type of institutional shape going forward with legal instruments, treaties. That is what I would.
Interesting. And just to understand that last point on instrument, do you mean a process within Africa or a process international?
China, Africa. So FOCAC has been there. It's some kind of forum. It hasn't into becoming an institution itself, sort of bilateral between African Union and China. So it could be institutionalized to deal with trade, investment, commerce, all of those things.
Okay.
That hasn't happened. And if this were to be a relationship between the West and Africa, it would have by now been some kind of economic cooperation agreement or treaty that might have. So if you look at the deals, 95% to 98% of Chinese trade relations with Africa is unilateral concessions that are not even enforceable. And the investment treaties are completely outdated. So there is really no meaningful legal infrastructure that binds the African side with the Chinese side. They're using the old mechanisms, and they need to be thinking about how to take it to the next level.
Great, that's really interesting. And yeah, we've not really touched on that, but I hope that's a really interesting area for future discussion and investigation, what that could look like. Professor Tang, what's your thoughts on if you're advising African governments on their interaction and strategy development with China?
For me, I just have two related points. The first is to think about the economic sustainability first, to give it a priority, because yeah, that's also means to trying to do this like in a market. Yeah, it should be some, although it's not a free market, not just a liberalist free market, but you should follow the market rule and use the commercial manners to make this economically sustainable, including both investment and finance. The second related to that is to actually put the investors' interest as a priority. Even between China and Africa, it seems that it's the Chinese government is partnering with the African government, but it's in fact, it's the Chinese enterprises, both the state-owned and private, they actually work both in Africa as enterprises, and they have their investors' interest. And I heard for them, a big complaint is that the African government, they do not take the investors' interests seriously. And that actually hurt their motivation to invest and operate in Africa in the long run. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. I think that's quite a lot of foreign investors do say that as well. So perhaps China's not alone in some of those things, but you're right. This is it's a multifaceted partnership and relationship. Sid, your answer. What's your advice to African governments? What next strategically?
I think the most important thing over the next 10 years that every African government must invest in is on human capital. Making sure their young are educated, skilled, there is gender equality, and more women are brought into the workforce rather than left behind. And third, looking at avenues where they are able to co-create with China and other parts of the world a new African economy that builds back better in the spirit of what the post-COVID-19 pandemic is talking about. Create a green economy, create a far more diverse economy that would give velocity and propulsion to an Africa which is young, vibrant, and has the capability of becoming the treasure trove for the rest of the world. Over to you.
Thank you, thank you. And I actually, we haven't really talked much about people-to-people cooperation and what that looks like and the future shape of that. But I think you've been able to give us that point, which is really helpful. Thank you so much. Look, let's have the audience give us their views now before we close. Do you think, so let's open the last poll for today. Audience, thank you for staying with us. Do you think African countries should now have publicly available China strategies? And you've got three options there. Each country needs, first option to answer, yes, each country needs to be more strategic in their interactions with China. 2, they should have a strategy, but it should not be publicly available. And I think we've got, clear views from our panelists that perhaps that is the case already. And then the third option for the audience to choose is no, a strategy towards China is not needed. So what are we going to, what's the result going to be? And we'll give the audience a couple more seconds to vote. While they do that, just thank you again to Professor Tang, to Sid, Professor Kidane. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, I think we're almost there. 2 more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and let's get the results. And I think we have it, a very clear recommendation from our audience. Yes, each country needs to be more strategic in their interactions with China. 86% of the audience voted for that. Just 14% said they should have an internal strategy, and we didn't have anybody saying that there shouldn't be a strategy. So I think we've got a clear, thank you panelists for persuading our audience of this question. I think the answer to for the overall webinar is yes, Africa can manage China, and it's how to do it. Let's and a kind of opening in different areas for Africans to do that, for us to do that. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you so much to our audience as well for some brilliant questions and really useful comments. Just to remind everybody, this is the 6th in our series. We have our last webinar coming up next week, which will be focused on, will be a roundup after the IMF and World Bank Spring meetings, looking at special drawing rights and looking at different country views on that, and how special drawing rights might be useful for the African continent, if at all, and also in dealing with things like climate change, which we touched on a little bit today as well. So please join us for that. If you haven't already signed up, please do. And again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you also to the DR team for arranging this and making all of it happen. And look forward to being in touch with you all again. Thank you, panelists, and take care. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Anna. Bye-bye.